The Road to Redemption. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. Ben Thompson had earned his reputation. He sat in his usual corner of the brightly lit showroom, the air conditioning humming quietly overhead. The sun blazed down outside, glinting off the polished hoods of the luxury cars parked in neat rows, but Ben was comfortable inside. He adjusted his crisp suit, the fabric perfectly tailored, as he surveyed the scene with the air of a man who knew he was the best at what he did. Ben wasn't just any car salesman. He was the dealership's top closer. He had a knack for reading people. Clients who walked in thinking they knew what they wanted often left with something far more expensive. He prided himself on his ability to size someone up in seconds. Their clothes, their demeanor, the way they spoke, it all told him what kind of customer they were. He played this game with precision, and more often than not, he won. To Ben, it wasn't about selling cars, it was about control. Every client who stepped onto the lot was a puzzle, and he was a master at solving it. Know the customer, know the sale, he would often say, brushing off compliments with false modesty, but secretly reveling in his ability to close even the most difficult deals. Ben's methods had always worked. He'd been in the business long enough to know who had money and who didn't, who was there to waste time and who was there to spend. He believed in judging a book by its cover because, in his experience, the cover told him everything he needed to know. It was a typical day in the showroom when Ben's attention shifted to a man who walked in alone. The man's attire was sharp, yet understated. A well-fitted suit, polished shoes, but not the usual flashy luxury brands Ben associated with Wacth. The man, tall and confident, moved with ease as he glanced around the cars on display. Ben leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His instincts kicked in, sizing up the new arrival. Another looker, he thought, recognizing the signs. People who came in to admire but never actually bought anything. But something about the man's calm confidence gave Ben pause. He watched as the man's fingers lightly brushed the smooth, polished surface of a sports car. There was no hesitation in his movements, no awe, just an appreciation for the craftsmanship. Still, Ben's initial assumption held strong. The man was clearly out of place. "Can I help you with something?" Ben finally called out, standing from his desk and approaching with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. His tone was professional, but the underlying skepticism was hard to miss. The man turned, his expression warm and polite. "Yes, I'm interested in purchasing one of these cars," he said calmly. "I've been considering an upgrade for my collection." Ben's brow raised at the word collection. He couldn't help the slight smirk that formed at the corners of his mouth. This man talking about a collection of luxury cars? He kept his tone neutral, but inside, he was already dismissing the possibility. "Interesting," Ben replied. "And what kind of car do you drive now?" The man's response was smooth, without missing a beat. "A Maserati, but I'm looking for something new." Ben almost laughed out loud. A Maserati? For this guy? He looked the man up and down again, trying to reconcile the modest suit with the image of a Maserati owner. It didn't fit, but he played along out of curiosity more than anything else. "Well, you must be doing well for yourself," Ben said, the sarcasm barely concealed. The man didn't flinch. He smiled politely. "I've worked hard for everything I have." Ben's skepticism deepened. He had no doubt that this was some kind of joke, or worse, a complete waste of his time. He decided to cut to the chase. "Well, these cars don't come cheap, as I'm sure you," Ben said, his tone becoming more condescending. "Maybe I can show you something more affordable." For the first time, the man's polite smile faded slightly. He met Ben's gaze evenly, his voice steady. "I'm well aware of the cost, but I'm interested in seeing your top models." Ben narrowed his eyes. It was clear that the man wasn't going to back down, but Ben wasn't ready to let go of his assumptions just yet. He folded his arms and leaned back slightly, still sizing him up. "We have a very particular clientele here," Ben said, his voice dripping with implication. "The kind of people who buy these cars don't just walk in off the street." The man raised an eyebrow at that, his smile gone, but he remained calm. "And what kind of people are you referring to?" Ben smirked. He thought he had the upper hand now. People who have the means to afford a car like this. Not everyone can. The tension in the air was palpable, but the man didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he remained composed, his disappointment or frustration visible only in the brief flicker in his eyes. He'd heard this treatment before. Ben could tell. The man simply nodded. "Well then," he said, glancing at Ben's name tag. "Why don't you show me what you have available, Ben?" Ben, still feeling smug, led the man through the showroom, pointing out various models with an air of superiority. He showed him a few of the higher-end cars, each time making subtle digs, suggesting that the cars might be a bit out of reach. But the man simply inspected each car with genuine interest, nodding thoughtfully, asking the occasional question. When they reached one of the most expensive cars in the dealership, a sleek, limited edition model, Ben couldn't resist. "This one here," he said, patting the hood, "might be a bit out of reach for you, but hey, it doesn't hurt to look, right?" The man's jaw clenched for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'll take it," he said simply. Ben blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me? I'll take the car. Write it up." Ben stared at the man, unsure if he was serious. He tried to gauge whether this was some kind of prank, but the man's expression remained steady, his voice calm and confident. Okay," Ben stammered, still skeptical. "Do you have the financing arranged, or—" The man let out a small chuckle, pulling a sleek black card from his jacket pocket. "No need for financing," he said, handing it to Ben. "I'll pay in full." Ben's eyes widened as he stared at the card. This wasn't just any credit card. It was one of those rare elite cards only available to the wealthiest people in the world. His face paled as he realized how badly he had misjudged the situation. "I'd like the card delivered to my office downtown," the man said, his voice cool. "And while you're at it, I'll take a few more cars for my team. Consider it a bulk purchase." Ben could barely form words. "What do you mean, your team?" The man smiled, but this time there was a sharp edge to it. "I'm not just here to buy a car, Ben. I'm here to make an acquisition." Ben's heart pounded in his chest as the words "make an acquisition" sank in. The man, Michael Anderson, as he would later learn, stood there calmly, watching the disbelief wash over Ben's face. "An acquisition?" Ben repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded. "That's right," he said evenly. "I've been working on acquiring this dealership chain for quite some time now, and today, the deal is final." Ben felt a wave of nausea roll through him. His head swam as he tried to process what was happening. He had spent the entire morning belittling and condescending to the man who now owned the very dealership where he worked. The full weight of his actions pressed down on him like a boulder, crushing his smug confidence in an instant. "You're the new owner?" Ben stammered, his face drained of color. "That's right," Michael said. "And I'm also the person you've been underestimating all morning." Ben's mind raced as he tried to think of something to say, anything to undo the damage he had caused. But no words came. He had judged Michael based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the clothes he wore, and now he was facing the consequences of his arrogance. Michael's voice remained calm, but there was a steely edge to it now. "Prejudice blinds you to opportunity, Ben. You were so focused on your assumptions about me that you didn't see the opportunity standing right in front of you." Ben swallowed hard, his throat tight. He could feel his career, his reputation, crumbling beneath him. He had worked so hard to build himself up in this industry, and now it seemed like it was all about to come crashing down. The days that followed were a blur for Ben. He could hardly focus at work, his mind consumed with the fear that he was about to be fired. Every time he saw Michael walking through the showroom, his stomach churned with anxiety. He avoided eye contact, keeping his head down and doing everything he could to stay out of sight. But the blow Ben feared the most never came. Michael didn't fire him. Instead, he made an announcement to the entire staff that would change the dealership forever. "We are going to be implementing a new diversity training program," Michael said, standing at the front of the showroom with the entire staff gathered before him. "This isn't just about checking a box. It's about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, can thrive. And I expect all of you to take it seriously." Ben stood in the back of the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was directed at him, even if Michael hadn't said it outright. Michael had given him a chance to learn, to grow, to change, but Ben wasn't sure if he deserved it. As the meeting ended and the staff began to disperse, Michael caught Ben's eye from across the room. There was no animosity in his expression, just a calm, steady gaze that made Ben feel even smaller. "Ben," Michael called, gesturing for him to stay behind. Ben's stomach twisted as he slowly made his way to the front of the room, his palms sweaty with nerves. He had no idea what to expect. Michael waited until the room was empty before speaking. "You're going to be one of the first to go through the diversity training program," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Ben nodded, unable to meet Michael's gaze. "I understand," he muttered, feeling the weight of his shame pressing down on him. Michael studied him for a moment before continuing. "I'm not firing you, Ben, but things are going to change around here. You need to understand that this isn't just about cars, it's about people. And if you can't see that, then you don't belong here." Ben felt a lump form in his throat as Michael's words sank in. He had never thought of his job in those terms before. To him, selling cars had always been about closing deals and making money. People were just a means to an end. But now he was being forced to confront the reality of his own biases, and it wasn't easy. The following week, Michael brought in a new team of managers, people from diverse racial, cultural, and gender backgrounds. Ben found himself working under a woman named Sarah Lee, a Korean-American manager with a sharp mind and a no-nonsense attitude. Sarah was everything Ben wasn't used to in a leader, and at first he struggled to adjust to her style. "Ben," Sarah said one morning as they went over the day's sales goals, "I know you're used to doing things a certain way, but we're going to try something different today." Ben bristled at the suggestion, his pride wounded. "I've been doing this for years," he said defensively. "I know what works." Sarah didn't miss a beat. "I'm not saying you don't know what works," she replied calmly, "but there's always room to learn. And today we're going to focus on listening to the customer, not just selling to them." Ben clenched his jaw but said nothing. He had no choice but to go along with it. Michael had made it clear that things were going to change, and if he wanted to keep his job, he would have to adapt. The rest of the day was a humbling experience for Ben. Sarah's approach to selling was entirely different from his own. She spent time getting to know the customers, asking them questions about their lives, their needs, their goals. She listened more than she talked, and by the end of the day, she had closed several deals. Without the hard sell tactics that Ben had always relied on. Ben couldn't deny the results, but it didn't sit well with him. He had built his career on a certain way of doing things, and now he was forced to change. It felt like a loss of control, and for someone like Ben, that was the hardest thing to swallow. The diversity training sessions began the following week. Ben sat in a small conference room with the rest of the staff, listening as the facilitator, a Black woman named Tanya, talked about the importance of understanding unconscious bias. "At its core," Tanya said, "unconscious bias is about the assumptions we make about people based on their appearance, their background, their gender, or their race. These assumptions can be harmful, even if we don't realize we're making them." Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew exactly what she was talking about. He had made those very assumptions about Michael, and it had nearly cost him everything. Tanya went on to share stories from her own life, times when she had been underestimated or treated differently because of her race. As Ben listened, he felt a pang of guilt. He had never considered what it might be like to be on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. He had always been in a position of power, using his assumptions to control the situation. But now, he was beginning to see how those assumptions could hurt others. By the end of the session, Ben felt raw and exposed. The walls he had built around himself, walls of arrogance and superiority, were beginning to crack. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, but deep down, he knew he had a lot to learn. Over the next few weeks, Ben tried to apply what he had learned in the diversity training sessions. He started listening more, not just to customers, but to his colleagues as well. He asked questions, took the time to understand where people were coming from, and slowly but surely, he began to let go of his preconceived notions. It wasn't easy. Ben had spent years viewing the world through a narrow lens, and old habits were hard to break. There were moments when he found himself slipping back into his old ways, judging customers based on their appearance or assuming he knew what they wanted before they even spoke. But each time he caught himself, he made an effort to correct it. He would stop, take a breath, and remind himself that there was more to a person than what he could see on the surface. Sarah noticed the change in Ben. Though she didn't say anything at first, she watched as he struggled with his own biases, as he fumbled through awkward conversations and made mistakes along the way. But she also saw the progress he was making, and she respected his effort. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging customer interaction, Sarah pulled Ben aside. "You're doing good work, Ben," she said, her tone sincere. Ben looked at her in surprise. "I don't feel like it," he admitted. "I feel like I'm stumbling through everything." Sarah smiled. "Change isn't easy, but the fact that you're trying, that's what matters. Keep at it." Ben nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Just maybe he could do this. Months had passed since Michael implemented the changes in the dealership, and Ben was slowly but steadily adjusting. He had begun listening to customers and colleagues more, breaking old habits, but there was still an edge of discomfort in his daily routine. Every morning, when he walked into the dealership, he reminded himself that things had changed and that he needed to adapt. Still, some part of him resisted fully embracing the new reality. One morning, a high-profile client was scheduled to visit the dealership. The customer was someone Michael had personally invited, a prominent figure in the city's business community. When the staff gathered for the morning meeting, Michael looked directly at Ben. "Ben, I want you to handle this one," Michael said, his tone firm but encouraging. "You've been making progress, and I think you're ready." Ben felt a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. This was his first major assignment since Michael had taken over the dealership, and the pressure to perform was immense. He nodded, masking his nerves with a confident smile. "I've got it covered," he said. When the client arrived, Ben's initial anxiety only grew. The man, Mr. Carter, was a distinguished African-American entrepreneur who had built a multi-million-dollar business from the ground up. He carried himself with an air of authority, his demeanor calm and assured. Ben felt the weight of his own past judgments pressing down on him, but he forced himself to push those thoughts aside. He approached Mr. Carter with a newfound respect, shaking his hand firmly and engaging in polite conversation. To his surprise, the interaction went smoothly. Mr. Carter was interested in purchasing several high-end vehicles for his company's executives, and Ben quickly realized that this sale could be one of the biggest deals of his career. But as they walked through the showroom, Ben's old habits threatened to resurface. He caught himself starting to make assumptions about what Mr. Carter might want or be able to afford, but he quickly checked himself. Instead of jumping to conclusions, he asked questions. He listened. By the end of the conversation, Mr. Carter had decided on the vehicles he wanted to purchase, and the sale was finalized. It was a massive win for the dealership, and for Ben personally. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of accomplishment that wasn't tied to his usual tactics. He had made the sale by listening, by treating Mr. Carter with the respect he deserved, and by focusing on the customer's needs, not his own biases. As Ben handed over the keys to the new cars, Mr. Carter smiled. "You did a great job today," he said. "You listened. That's a rare quality in a salesman." Ben felt a surge of pride, but it was different from the pride he had once felt when closing a deal. This time, it wasn't about the money or the numbers. It was about something deeper, something that felt real. Just a week after Ben's success with Mr. Carter, an old friend from his early days in the dealership dropped by for a visit. Mark was someone Ben had worked with years ago, back when the dealership operated under a different owner. Mark was brash, arrogant, and still clung to the old-school mentality that had once been the norm in their business. As they sat down in the break room to catch up, Mark leaned in, a smirk on his face. "I heard about all the changes happening around here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "New management, diversity training, all that politically correct nonsense." Ben's stomach tightened. He had been expecting this conversation ever since Mark called to say he was coming by. Still, the blatant dismissiveness in Mark's tone caught him off guard. "It's been different," Ben replied carefully, not wanting to escalate the conversation. "But things are going well." Mark laughed, shaking his head. "Man, I can't believe you're going along with all this. Diversity training? Come on. You and I both know this place was doing just fine before." Ben felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. The old Ben, the one who would have agreed with Mark, who would have laughed off the idea of diversity training, was gone, or at least he was trying to be. But the temptation to fall back into old habits was strong, especially with someone like Mark, who represented everything Ben had once been. Mark continued, oblivious to Ben's inner struggle. "Look at this place now. A bunch of new people. And for what? You think any of them can sell like we did? No way." Ben clenched his jaw, the tension building inside him. He knew Mark was wrong. He knew that the changes Michael had implemented were making the dealership better, stronger. The new team was thriving, and Ben had seen firsthand how much they had brought to the table. But standing up to someone like Mark wasn't easy. Finally, Ben spoke, his voice steady but firm. "You're wrong, Mark," he said. "The new team is amazing. They bring fresh ideas, new perspectives, and they're doing things I never would have thought of. This place is better now, and it's because of the changes." Mark blinked, taken aback by Ben's response. "Are you serious?" he asked, incredulous. "You've really bought into all this?" Ben nodded, his conviction growing stronger with each word. "I have. And you should too. Things are changing, Mark. You can either adapt or get left behind." The tension in the room was palpable as Mark stared at Ben, clearly struggling to comprehend the transformation in his old friend. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Mark stood up, shaking his head. "You've changed, man," he muttered before walking out of the room. Ben watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He knew that standing up to Mark was the right thing to do, but it hadn't been easy. In that moment, he realized just how far he had come, and how much further he still had to go. In the weeks that followed, Ben's relationship with Michael deepened. Despite everything that had happened between them, Michael had never treated Ben with anything less than professionalism and respect. It was something that Ben had come to admire greatly. One afternoon, after a particularly successful sales month, Michael called Ben into his office. Ben entered with a sense of trepidation, unsure of what to expect. "Sit down, Ben," Michael said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Ben took a seat, his posture stiff. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Michael nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I've been watching your progress," he said. "You've been doing great work lately. The numbers speak for themselves, but it's more than that. I've noticed a change in you." Ben swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Michael's words. "I've been trying," he said quietly, "to do better." Michael smiled, though it was faint. "I've seen that. You've come a long way since the day we met." Ben winced slightly, remembering how that first encounter had gone down. "I'll never forget that day," he said softly. "I was wrong, so wrong." Michael's expression softened. "We all make mistakes, Ben. What matters is that you've learned from it. You've not only improved as a salesman, but as a person. That's what's important." Ben nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I owe that to you," he said. "You gave me a chance when you didn't have to. Most people wouldn't have." Michael shrugged. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Ben, and you earned yours." For a moment, the room was quiet, the air filled with unspoken understanding. Ben couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. He had spent so many years living in a world where second chances weren't given freely, where people were judged harshly for their mistakes. But Michael's kindness had taught him the value of empathy, and it was a lesson that would stick with him forever. As the months passed, Ben continued to thrive under Michael's leadership. He threw himself into his work, not just as a salesman, but as a mentor to the new employees. The dealership was more successful than it had ever been, and much of that success was due to the diverse team Michael had built. Ben found himself learning from his colleagues in ways he had never expected. He had once thought that he had all the answers, that his way was the best way. But now he saw the value in different perspectives, in fresh ideas, in collaboration. One day, as Ben was walking through the dealership, he overheard two new hires talking excitedly about their latest sale. They were both young, from different racial and cultural backgrounds, and they had just closed a deal that Ben would have never approached in the same way. He smiled to himself as he listened to their conversation, feeling a sense of pride in the team he had once been so skeptical of. They weren't just competent, they were brilliant, and they were teaching him more than he had ever thought possible. Months passed, and the dealership flourished under Michael's leadership and the diverse team he had brought in. Ben had become a key figure in the team's success, embracing his role as a mentor and leader. He had learned to value the different perspectives his colleagues brought to the table and had fully integrated the lessons of empathy and inclusivity into his work. But the biggest test of Ben's transformation was yet to come. One Friday morning, Michael called Ben into his office. "We've got a group of new hires starting next week," Michael said, sitting back in his chair. "I want you to lead their onboarding and training." Ben blinked, surprised. While he had taken on more responsibility over the past months, this was the first time Michael had entrusted him with such a critical task. The new hires would be the future of the dealership, and their first impressions would be shaped by him. "I think you're ready," Michael added, as if reading Ben's mind. "You've come a long way, Ben. Now it's time for you to teach what you've learned." Ben nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and nervousness. He knew how much was riding on this. The dealership's success wasn't just about selling cars. It was about creating a culture of inclusivity and respect. And now, it was his job to ensure that the new hires understood that. The following Monday, Ben greeted the new recruits as they gathered in the showroom for their first day of training. They came from all walks of life, different races, cultures, and genders. A few months ago, Ben would have judged them based on their appearance, making assumptions about their abilities before they even had a chance to prove themselves. But today, he saw them for what they were, people, each with their own unique experiences and perspectives. As Ben led them through the training, he focused not just on the technical aspects of the job, but on the values that Michael had instilled in the dealership. He spoke about the importance of listening to customers, of treating everyone with respect, and of seeing beyond appearances. The new hires were eager to learn, and Ben found himself thriving in his new role as a mentor. By the end of the week, the training was complete, and the new team was ready to hit the showroom floor. Ben felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he watched them interact with customers, using the skills and values he had taught them. For the first time, he understood what Michael had meant about the true meaning of leadership. It wasn't about power or control. It was about lifting others up and helping them succeed. But Ben's journey wasn't over yet. Just when things seemed to be going well, a new challenge emerged, one that would test everything he had learned. One afternoon, Michael received a call from a major investor who had been supporting the dealership chain for years. The investor, Mr. Franklin, was an old-school businessman who valued profits above all else. He had been watching the changes at the dealership with growing concern. And now he was threatening to pull his funding if Michael didn't roll back some of the inclusivity initiatives. Michael called an emergency meeting with Ben and the other senior staff members to discuss the situation. "We've worked too hard to build this," Michael said, his voice tense. "But without the funding from Mr. Franklin, we could lose everything." Ben felt a surge of anger as he listened to Michael explain the situation. After everything they had done to create a more inclusive and successful dealership, now it was all at risk because of one man's outdated views. Ben couldn't stand the thought of going back to the way things were before. "We can't let him do this," Ben said, his voice firm. "We've seen how much better things are now. The dealership is thriving, and it's because of the changes we've made. If we go back, we'll lose everything we've worked for." Michael nodded, but his expression was grim. "I agree. But Mr. Franklin holds a lot of power. If we don't convince him, we could be in serious trouble." For the first time, Ben realized that this wasn't just about him or the dealership. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. He thought back to the conversation he had with Mark all those months ago, when he had stood up to his old friend and defended the changes at the dealership. This was the same, but on a much larger scale. "I'll talk to him," Ben said suddenly. Michael looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure?" Ben nodded. "I've come this far. I won't let him take this away from us." The next day, Ben and Michael arranged a meeting with Mr. Franklin. The older man sat across from them in Michael's office, his expression stern and unyielding. "I don't like what I've been hearing," Mr. Franklin said, his voice gruff. "All these changes, diversity training, New hires from different backgrounds. It's not how we've done things in the past, and I'm not convinced it's good for business. Ben took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment of truth. With all due respect, Mr. Franklin, Ben began, the way we did things in the past wasn't working. The dealership was stagnating. We've made these changes because we want to build something better, something that's not just profitable, but sustainable. Mr. Franklin raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. And what makes you think these changes are sustainable? Ben leaned forward, his voice steady. Because we've already seen the results. Our sales have increased, our customer base has expanded, and we've built a team that's stronger and more innovative than ever before. The diversity we've embraced has brought new ideas and fresh perspectives, and that's why we're succeeding. Mr. Franklin didn't say anything for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Ben. Ben held his breath, waiting for the response. Finally, Mr. Franklin sighed and leaned back in his chair. I have to admit, he said slowly, I've been watching the numbers and they're better than I expected, but I still don't like the idea of changing the way we've always done things. Ben smiled slightly, sensing a small victory. Change is never easy, he said, but it's necessary if we want to keep growing. We're not just selling cars, Mr. Franklin. We're building something bigger. A community, a place where people from all backgrounds can succeed, and that's good for business too. There was another long silence as Mr. Franklin considered Ben's words. Finally, he nodded, a reluctant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. All right, he said, I'll give it a little more time. But if the numbers start to slip, we'll have to reconsider. Ben nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you. We won't let you down. As Mr. Franklin left the office, Ben turned to Michael, who was smiling proudly. You did it, Michael said. Ben shook his head. We did it. Together. In the months that followed, the dealership continued to thrive. The new hires that Ben had trained flourished in their roles, bringing fresh energy and innovation to the team. The dealership's reputation grew, not just for its high-end cars, but for its inclusive culture and commitment to diversity. Ben had become one of the dealership's top leaders, overseeing several locations across the state. Under his leadership, the dealerships flourished, known for their success and inclusivity. Ben's transformation was complete. He was no longer the brash, arrogant salesman who judged people based on their appearances. He had become a leader who valued people for their skills, their experiences, and their potential. One evening, after a particularly successful sales month, Ben and Michael sat down for a drink at a local bar. It had been a long time since their first encounter, and both men had come a long way since then. As they clinked glasses, Ben looked at Michael, gratitude evident in his eyes. You've changed my life, Ben said quietly. I don't think I can ever repay you. Michael smiled, his expression warm. You don't need to repay me, Ben. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep learning. Keep growing. Ben nodded, knowing that those words were more valuable than any material reward. In that moment, he realized that the greatest lesson he had learned wasn't just about prejudice or diversity. It was about the power of redemption and the strength of character that comes from admitting when you're wrong. Years later, Ben and Michael's dealership chain would be known as one of the most successful and inclusive in the country, a testament to the values they both held dear. Ben continued to mentor new employees, sharing his story of redemption with anyone who would listen. He wanted others to understand that it was never too late to change, that they too could confront their own biases and become better versions of themselves. As Ben continued to work side by side with Michael, he never forgot the day his life had changed, the day a man he had once underestimated had given him the opportunity to become the best version of himself. Years had passed since Ben Thompson first stepped into the role of mentor and leader at the dealership. The once brash, arrogant salesman had transformed into someone who was respected not only for his ability to close deals, but for the way he guided others and shaped the dealership's culture. Under his leadership and Michael's vision, the dealership had expanded to multiple locations across the state, becoming a symbol of success built on inclusivity, respect, and empathy. On a quiet afternoon after a long day of work, Ben sat alone in his office, reflecting on how far he had come. The walls around him were adorned with awards and accolades, not just for sales, but for the dealership's commitment to diversity and community outreach. The recognition was something Ben was proud of, but it wasn't what defined him anymore. He pulled open the drawer of his desk and took out a small, worn notebook. It was something he had started keeping after his first conversation with Michael, a way to track his thoughts and progress as he tried to navigate the changes in his life. As he flipped through the pages, he smiled at the memories. The early entries were filled with frustration and doubt, scribbled notes about his struggles to adapt to the new team and the diversity training. But as the pages went on, the tone shifted. The frustration gave way to reflection, and the doubt transformed into a determination to be better. The last few entries were written in a different hand, steadier, more confident. They reflected the person Ben had become. "I've learned that true success isn't about money or power," one entry read. "It's about people. It's about empathy. It's about lifting others up, not just stepping on them to get ahead." Ben closed the notebook, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He had changed, truly changed, and it wasn't just for himself. It was for the people he worked with, the people he mentored, and the people he now called friends. The dealership had become a beacon of success in the industry, not just for its sales numbers, but for the culture it had created. Other dealerships and businesses in the area had taken notice of the changes Michael and Ben had implemented, and they had started to adopt similar practices. Michael had always believed that a diverse team could lead to better results, and the proof was in the dealership's performance. Each new hire brought fresh ideas, new approaches, and different perspectives that enriched the dealership's operations. Customers, too, had noticed the difference. The dealership was no longer just a place to buy cars. It was a place where people felt valued, where their needs were understood, and where they were treated with respect, regardless of their background. The community outreach programs Michael had initiated, with Ben's help, had also made a significant impact. The dealership partnered with local organizations to provide job training for underprivileged youth, offering them a pathway into the automotive industry. It was a way of giving back to the community and ensuring that the next generation had the opportunities they deserved. Ben often spoke at these training sessions, sharing his own story of transformation with the young people who attended. He talked about his mistakes, his prejudices, and how he had learned to overcome them. His message was simple. It's never too late to change. You just have to be willing to see the world through a different lens. These sessions were some of the most fulfilling moments of Ben's career. He could see the impact his words had on the young people in the room, the way their eyes lit up when they realized that they, too, could overcome their challenges and make a better life for themselves. As the years went by, Ben continued to grow as a leader, but there came a point when he realized it was time for a new challenge. The dealership was thriving, and he felt confident that the team he had mentored could continue to lead it to even greater success. One evening, Ben sat down with Michael over dinner, the two of them reminiscing about how far they had come. "You've built something incredible here," Ben said, raising his glass in a toast, "and I'm proud to have been a part of it." Michael smiled, clinking his glass against Ben's. "We built it together, Ben. I couldn't have done it without you." They both sat in comfortable silence for a moment, reflecting on the journey they had shared. "I've been thinking," Ben said after a while, "it might be time for me to step back from the day-to-day operations. I've loved every minute of this, but I think I'm ready for something new." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. You've more than earned the right to take a step back. But what's next for you?" Ben smiled, a sense of excitement bubbling up inside him. "I've been thinking about starting a mentorship program, something bigger than just the dealership. I want to help other businesses adopt the kind of inclusive practices we've implemented here. I think we've proven that it works, and I want to share that with others." Michael's eyes lit up with approval. "That sounds like an incredible idea. You've got my full support, whatever you need." And so, with Michael's blessing, Ben began the next chapter of his journey. He founded a consulting firm dedicated to helping businesses create more inclusive environments, using the lessons he had learned at the dealership as the foundation for his work. The firm quickly gained traction, with companies across the country seeking Ben's expertise in building diverse, successful teams. Ben found a new sense of purpose in this work, and it felt like the culmination of everything he had learned. He wasn't just helping businesses grow, he was helping people grow, and that, to him, was the greatest success of all. Years later, Ben stood at the podium of a large conference, addressing a room full of business leaders from across the country. His firm had grown beyond anything he had imagined, and he was now regarded as one of the foremost experts on diversity and inclusion in the corporate world. As he spoke, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He talked about his early days as a car salesman, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned from Michael. He shared the story of how the dealership had transformed from a place of narrow thinking to one of inclusivity, respect, and success. Diversity isn't just a buzzword, Ben said, his voice strong and confident. It's the key to unlocking the full potential of your team. When you bring people from different backgrounds together, you create something greater than the sum of its parts. You create innovation, creativity, and growth. But more than that, you create a place where people feel valued, where they can bring themselves to work. And that, my friends, is what true success looks like. The audience erupted into applause, and as Ben stepped away from the podium, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come full circle, from a man blinded by his own biases to someone who had dedicated his life to helping others see beyond their assumptions. As the conference ended and people began to file out of the room, Michael approached Ben, a proud smile on his face. "You've done well, Ben," Michael said, clapping him on the back. "You've built something incredible." Ben smiled, feeling a sense of peace. "I learned from the best." Together they walked out into the warm evening air, the weight of their shared journey resting lightly on their shoulders. The world had changed, and so had they. And in that moment, Ben knew that no matter where life took him next, he would continue to carry out the lessons he had learned with him. Lessons of empathy, growth, and the power of redemption.